Let's see how this works in After Effects. We're going to start by creating a new composition. We want to specify a slightly larger size so that our files are not too big. So I'd like you to use 720 for the height, and then make sure that the pixel aspect ratio is set to square pixels, and change your frame rate to 24 frames per second. You can also, if you have a smaller laptop or computer, you can set the height to 480. But if you want a higher quality output, then use 720. So these are the settings you should start with, and you should use these in future projects. Put OK, and it will create a new composition. Now, the part of the bottom here, the bottom right is the timeline area. The bottom left is the layers. So the timeline corresponds to the layers they created. We're going to start by right-clicking in the bottom left and saying New Shape Layer. That will give us a place where we can create new shapes. We see that it creates a timeline and it creates a layer called Shapes. Now I'm going to use this tiny arrow to open the layer and see what's inside of it, and right now there's nothing inside. So when I create a shape layer, I get these tools at the top that allow me to create and draw certain shapes. This toolbar is the toolbar that lets me create things inside of After Effects. So I'm going to start by creating an ellipse. Now once I've created it, if I start clicking again, I'll get more ellipses. I'm just going to undo those. And then I'm going to use the switch to the select tool to select the ellipse. So I see that once I've done that, the ellipse appears here as an object, as a shape inside of this layer. I'm just going to rename this as a layer, just so that it's a little clearer that this is the layer and not a shape. So this is my ellipse and it's inside this layer. The next thing I'm going to do is decrease the length of my animation, because I only want to make animations that are around 20 to 30 seconds. So this bar tells how long my animation is. I'm going to pull this in from the right. You can see that M means minutes. So right now it's on the scale of 10 minutes, which is very long. So I'm going to keep bringing this to the left until my animation gets to around the scale of between 0 and 30 seconds. Right? So, and I have just adjusted that with this bar. Okay, so now if I press Spacebar, it will start playing, and you see this red line indicates the play. There's no animation yet, so there's nothing really to see. So now we're going to start adding keyframes in order to create an animation. Many different things can be animated, and I want to animate the position of this object. So I've opened up Transform, and I'm looking at the position of the object. And now this stopwatch tells me that I can create keyframes. If I click it, it says the keyframes are now activated for that. This gives me a few different tools that I can use. This icon here is for adding a new keyframe, and these buttons, left, right arrows, are for moving to the previous and next keyframe, and you'll use them quite often. We move the time slider to another time, let's say 5 seconds, and then we move the object to where we want it to be at that time. Now notice that the object does not exactly line up with the line. It doesn't line up where my point is, and that can be easily fixed. So we go inside of Ellipse, we look at the transform for the ellipse, and we set its position to 0, 0. That says I want the ellipse to be at the center of the layer. That is different from the layers transform, the motion of the layer. And so I'm going to collapse the ellipse down again, and now I'm just going to make sure that my animation happens on the layer. Now the ellipse matches up at the center position of my animation. If I move the slider now between those two frames, I can see that it does a linear animation between those points. Let's see what happens if I go to 15 seconds and then move it again. If I move it again in 15 seconds, it automatically does curved interpolation. And you can see now that it's going to do a smooth interpolation between those points. If I add another keyframe at 20 seconds by moving the object again, it continues to create curves between those points. I can animate at any time by simply pressing the spacebar. This blue line is called a motion curve, and it shows how the object is going to move over time. Now, this right now is happening very slowly. It's happening over many seconds, over 20 seconds. So in order to make it faster, I'm going to zoom in, and I'm going to move my keyframes closer together, much closer together. And this will speed up the animation overall. So by having keyframes close together, as we saw earlier, the animation will take place faster. We now see the individual dots actually represent individual frames in the animation. By pressing spacebar, we get to play this back, and we can see that it happens a lot quicker now. Editing the motion curve is an important process in any animation. The only places I can move the curve are at the keyframes. So by moving the keyframes around, I am able to change an animation. We see these little handles on the side. These are called tangents. By pulling these, I can change the shape of the curve. This lets me change the appearance of the animation, give me very precise control over a curved animation. Every keyframe can be modified in this way, and I can move the keyframes around, but I cannot move the points in between because I would need a new keyframe. I can create new keyframes by moving the time slider to a particular time and then moving the object in the view, and that will automatically generate a new keyframe at that place. If I don't want a keyframe, I can always select it in the time window and just press the delete key, and that will remove the keyframe. Another way to edit keyframes is by using these arrows which indicate go to next keyframe or go to previous keyframe. This lets me jump through the keyframes easily without having to click on them in the window. We talked a little bit earlier about linear motion. Let's see how we can change that using After Effects. If I click on a key and then I right-click it, I have these options for what I can do with that key. And if I change the keyframe interpolation, I can change the spatial interpolation to linear. Then all the points coming into and out of that key will be along a line. Notice the others are still curves, so I can mix curves with linear motion. If I want them all to be linear, I can change the keyframes and change the spatial interpolation from curve to linear. This lets me move something along lines instead of along a curve. You'll see that the sphere follows, it kind of jumps around or bounces around instead of following a smooth curve. Let's see what happens now when we add a new shape. I'm going to choose the shape tool, the ellipse tool from the toolbar, and I'm going to create another shape right next to this one. Just to help distinguish it, I'm going to make it a slightly different color. I'm going to make it orange. Now, when I create a new shape, it automatically created a new shape layer. So that means that it will not animate the same as this one. However, if I select first shape layer and then I create a new shape, then it will animate with that because they are on the same layer. So how shapes animate together depends on what layer you put them on. If you put them on different layers, then they'll animate differently. And if you put them on the same layer, they'll move together for that layer. You can close these arrows by clicking on them, and in that way you can go back and look at just what your layers are. So I'm going to rename this as the orange layer, and rename this one as the red layer by right-clicking on it. This will help me just to distinguish them. Inside the red layer, I see the contents has two ellipses, these two ellipses. So if I want to, by selecting a single ellipse, I can change just that position of that ellipse relative to the other one. But because the animation is on the layer, they will be moving together. Let's see what happens when I rotate a layer. Here I'm going to change the rotation, and we can see that the two shapes, they rotate together. Right now, rotation is not animated, but what's really cool about After Effects is that nearly everything can be animated. You can animate line styles and line weights. You can animate the caps and the strokes of shapes. You can animate their color. Anything that has this stopwatch icon next to it can be animated with keyframes. So going back to the rotation, let's try and animate rotation. I click on the stopwatch and that brings me new keyframes. I then move the time slider to a different location. I change the rotation I can change the rotation by just adjusting it here. When I go back to the beginning, we can now see that as I animate this, the shape is rotating during the time that it's moving. So shapes can have multiple animations on different, what are called channels. These are called channels. So here I'm animating the position and the rotation of the shape. If I click on New Keyframe, I'll get a new keyframe for rotation. Then I can change its orientation again. A few things are very useful at this point. If you find yourself getting lost, you can always undo and redo to go back to previous steps. Another thing that's very useful is to just delete keyframes. I can delete a single keyframe by just selecting it and pressing the delete key, or I can select a box around multiple keyframes and delete all those keyframes. In this case, it lets me get rid of all the rotation so I can start that part over again. Another fast way to turn off animation, which will delete all your keyframes, is just to disable the stopwatch. Now the object is not moving at all again. If I undo, I will get the keyframes back. As you can see, this already gives you a lot of possibilities. I can create all different kinds of shapes. By holding down the ellipse tool, it allows me to create rectangles and other polygonal shapes. For example, I can create a rectangle on the same layer. It will start out rotated with the other objects. I could also potentially create a new layer, and if I wanted, I can create lines by using the pen tool. Here I create a triangle using the pen tool. This exists on a different layer. I can give it another color. Again, I go to Transform. I figure out where I would like it to start. Now I can animate the position by activating the stopwatch and then moving in time and setting different positions for this animated object. So now this triangle has a different animation. We can also zoom the main display window, and this lets us see our animation as it exists in the entire viewport. Often you will want to work with the entire display shown, and then you can animate inside of that. But it's sometimes useful to be able to zoom in and out, just like you can with an image in Illustrator. That's it for a quick introduction to After Effects. If you'd like, you can also add a music layer and animate your shapes to music. This is easy as just bringing in and dropping in an MP3 and then placing a layer for it so that it will play at the same time as your shapes. That's it, and I hope you look forward to the next video.